Hey there! Welcome to my darkroom. Today, I'm going to teach you how you can eliminate test strips from your workflow entirely. We'll do this by determining your paper's maximum exposure for black. This will be a time that you can use in the future to proof your rolls of film, to validate that your exposure is correct, and to validate that your development is correct. So, why do we want to do such a thing? We undergo this process to determine a baseline regarding how our film interacts with our paper. In scientific terms, we'll use this as a control variable for future experimentation. This video is for intermediate darkroom practitioners. Maybe you've finished intro photo and you're interested in the next step. It's also for anyone who wants to bring some of the consistency that they're used to from their digital workflow into the darkroom. What do you need to do this process? Well, first and foremost, you're going to need at least one roll of black and white photographic film. Any black and white photographic film will work, and you will want to perform this process on every black and white film that you regularly use. In addition, you'll need some silver gelatin photographic paper. RC paper works fine. Fiber-based paper works fine. And similarly to the film, you'll want to do this for every paper that you use regularly as well. As will become evident at the end of the video, for every combination of film and paper that you might expose on and print on, you will want to perform this process. Before we jump into the procedure, I'll give a quick overview of exactly what we're going to do. Essentially, we'll take our roll of film and we will develop it blank. We'll cut that film down into strips of an appropriate width to fill our paper, and then we'll proof that piece of film on a half sheet of our paper. We'll develop our paper, and once we're done with that, we'll let it dry and we'll analyze. Our analysis should reveal our paper's maximum exposure for black given our film. Alright, so let's chat about developing that blank roll of film. If you're at all uncertain of your gear, it's not a bad idea to run the blank roll through your camera first. You can simply shoot each shot with the lens cap on if your camera requires you to do that. This will let you determine if your camera has light leaks or any other issues that you might want to work out before you proceed with the maximum exposure for black calculation. Otherwise, if you're sure of your gear, you can throw it right into your development regimen. It's a good idea when you're doing this process to use the same chemistry that you're planning on using regularly in the future. This is because chemistry, like your developer, can impact your film's base fog, which is exactly what we're measuring when we calculate our maximum exposure for black. As a starting time, if you don't have a personal development time for your film yet, you can simply use the manufacturer's recommendation. Once your film's developed, hang it to dry, and once it's well dried, cut it down into strips of 6 or 7. These strips should be wide enough to fill the length of your paper. Once your roll of film's developed, it's time to go into the darkroom. Let's chat about how we'll set up our enlarger. Alright, so before we jump into our exposure and our chemistry with our paper, let's chat about how we set up our enlarger. When it comes to setting up your enlarger for your maximum exposure for black calculation, you're going to want to use a similar setup to when you're making a contact sheet or a proof. The first thing that'll be important is that you use the appropriate focal length lens. I've got my Schneider Crucianock 50mm here, the normal focal length for 35mm film. You want to make sure you're using the appropriate lens for your film format because you want your number to be able to transfer when you are enlarging later on. So let's pop this in the enlarger. The next thing we'll want to do is we'll want to make sure we insert the correct negative carrier. Again, we'll just use an empty negative carrier, but it's important that we do this so that we have a good idea of where the boundaries of our light cone are when we're working with our maximum exposure for black. I've got the 35mm carrier here. Let's pop it in. With our lens and our negative carrier inserted, it's time to set up our proofer. I've got one of these nice glass Patterson proofers. However, a sheet of glass and some foam will work just as well. Alright, so once your enlarger's set up top, let's set up the proofer. So set your proofer, of course, on your enlarger baseboard, and you're going to want to turn your enlarger onto focus. Make sure that the aperture is all the way open, and let me turn off the light so you can see what I'm doing a little better. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to position our proofer such that it lies right in the middle of the cone of light produced by our enlarger. Then we're going to want to adjust the enlarger's height so that the edges of the light fall about 1/2 inch beyond the edges of our proofer. Make sure that your focus is good on the surface of the proofer. You can do this just by positioning it. Get the edges nice and sharp, and then stop your lens down, and you're good to go. Turn your timer off. I'll demonstrate the next part of the process in the light, since my darkroom gets pretty dark when the lights are off, despite having bright, safe lights. Essentially what you're going to do is you'll remove a piece of paper from your box and cut it in half, the long way. You should have a strip of your developed film about this long. It should look just like this. Open up the glass on your proofer. Put the paper in emulsion side up. Place the film on top of it. And push down firmly. Make sure everything's nice and flat. Once your paper is set up your timer. We'll start off with a uniform base exposure of 10 seconds. With everything set up, expose. Once I've given it my base exposure, it's time to create my test strip. I'm going to set my timer to 1 second, and I'll get out a piece of card. An old envelope for photographic paper works great. I'll cover up all but 1 inch of the paper, and I'll give it a second of exposure. Then I'll uncover another inch, and I'll repeat this process. I'll go step by step until all but the last inch of the paper is covered. I'll leave this. Put your card away, open your proofer, set your film aside, and we can develop our paper. All right, so you've developed your paper and you've let it dry. You should get something like this. We see the image of the piece of film on it, and we can see it's light at one end and it's dark at the other. If it's fully dark, that means that your base exposure was too long, and instead of doing 10 seconds, maybe you should do 5 or 7. So if that's the case, go back in the darkroom and start over. If it's such that you never see the changes in the different gradations stop, that means that your base exposure is too short. So if you use 10 seconds, maybe you need to use 11 or 12. So again, if that's the case, go back down and give it another try. In my case here, you can see this has come out pretty well. And what we see is, on the light end, we have our exposure at 10, and then we have our exposure at 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. What I'm looking for here as I analyze is where, to my eye, I can no longer tell the difference between two bands. So I see a difference between 10 and 11. I see a difference between 11 and 12. And it's probably hard for you guys to see on camera, but I also see a difference between 12 and 13. However, after 13, I don't see a difference going into 14 or 15, so I know that 13 seconds will be my maximum exposure for black, in this case for my FOMA fiber-based variable contrast paper. Going forward, I'll use this time whenever I'm proofing anything. So, for example, from this, I can tell things such as, in this case, I can tell my highlights are overdeveloped, right? I'm losing detail in the light parts. Otherwise, maybe if I want more detail out of the shadows back here, I can tell that my film is underexposed. And since I know that that time is universal for any time I'm putting this film on this paper, I've ruled out the idea that perhaps the proof is just wrong. Going forward, I'll also use this time, or some variation of it, when I'm making work prints. For example, each of these work prints is a negative from this film, printed on my paper at the same exact time. For example, I can tell that here I've underexposed the film slightly. My detail in my trees here in the background is lost. Similarly, here I can tell that I might be slightly overdeveloped. I'm losing some detail in the highlights here. Of course, it's important to remember that this time will only serve as some baseline guardrails for us. For example, while this was proofed at my normal maximum exposure for black, when I blew it up, I found that I could get more detail out of it, and so I diverged in making my final print. However, when it came time to make work prints of the roll, I was able to get through it really quick, see that I wanted to enlarge this image, and then figure all of that out at the final print stage. So let's conclude. Today, I taught you how to determine the maximum exposure for black for your film and your paper. You'll be able to use this time in the future when you go to proof rolls of film, when you go to make work prints, and when you go to make final prints as a starting time. In addition, this time will serve as a baseline going forward as we look towards developing our own personal film speed and our own personal development time for ensuring that our film is exposed and developed correctly according to our own workflow. I hope this video served as a small taste of some of the precision that you can bring into your photography, even when you're not working with a computer. Analog photography can be so much more than just leaving things up to chance and seeing what comes out. You can make these materials serve your intention and serve your photographic vision. Thanks for watching.